Welcome to Pop Off, a little segment that we have here at Pop and Play where we take a few minutes to chat about education, play, and pop culture as it's happening in the public conversation. I'm your host, Nathan Holbert, and I am joined by the zine queen herself, Haeny and
Zine queen?
That's right.
Wow.
You heard it here.
Sorry, to actual zine makers, don't take offense to that. Hi, okay. So, in today's short episode, we thought we might take a few minutes to pop off about questions that we get asked all the time as educational researchers and professors of education and play and technology. And in the spirit of inquiry, obviously there are no dumb questions. But we want to talk about some of the questions we get asked a lot and admit to all of you that we don't have all the answers.
These are questions that people ask a lot because they're hard and
impossible sometimes.
And they're impossible, and and they're connected and sort of feel intense around things that you care about. So they're reasonable questions that people are asking.
Okay.
Well, let's start with one then, and
Okay.
I'm going to throw it to you, but I also have some thoughts on this question. So the question that we get asked pretty frequently is, how much screen time can my kids have? And then this goes to anywhere from, is it okay to have a screen at all? Or am I doing too much screen time? They want to know what's the right amount of screen time for kids.
Yeah. A very good question. No, I'm just kidding. Kind of not a very good question, but I do remember 10 years ago when I was doing job talks, I got asked that a lot because I'm in early childhood,
right, and
people are very concerned about how much screen time young kids will have and if it will mess up their brains, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember even then I didn't actually have a good answer for it because I think about how much screen time I get. And it's very appalling. Like one of my colleagues was like, how do you watch all of these shows? Like, when do you watch them? And I was like, oh, screen time is endless for me. There is actually no limits on that.
I've been astonished by how much you
I know. I can consume a lot of stuff. And I would say I'm a pretty smart person.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
I've accomplished things.
I mean, think of the number of shows you've watched.
Yes, and how inspired I've been. I also think about like my nephew Max. Shout out to Max.
Hey, Max.
No shade on you. His screen time is like literally like every waking minute of the day, maybe aside from going to school. And I noticed that there's like so much that he gets out of his screen time actually that isn't necessarily dictated towards him. It's not like we give him a quiz like, what did you learn on Blippi or something, right? Or what did you learn from watching this episode of Paw Patrol or, whatnot. But I feel like there's like phrases that he repeats, like things that he uses when he interacts with us, like random factoids that we never knew he actually knew about anything, like that he just kind of spouts out of nowhere. And it's actually very pleasant and very delightful. And so I feel like for me, the better question might be what's happening during screen time, like socially, emotionally, intellectually, even relationally. And maybe it's less about how much and more about to what ends. Right. And I think about that, like even the early days when people would ask me about screen time, it was because like 10 years ago, people were kind of nervous about screens because it wasn't like a daily thing, right? Right.
They were in one location of the house and it kind of required a certain set of procedures to do it.
Right.
Whereas
but
now you can just...
we live in a totally different time. Yeah. Right. And so...
like a screen right here in front of me.
Right. Exactly. So I feel like the parameters of that is actually very different.
Yeah. And to pick up on a couple things that you mentioned too, like one is the kinds of things that kids, and you used, I really like the words you used. You said pick up when they engage in screen time. And that's a good word choice because the other word choice that people always want to use is what do kids learn, which I love the word learn, don't get me wrong. But when we use learn in this context, I think what usually happens is people assume learning has to be a certain kind of learning. And look, my kids, speaking of things that they picked up, became absolute experts on sea creatures because they would watch this cartoon Octonauts like nonstop.
Oh my God, I know that show. Yes.
Creature report. And that was great, right? But and it's easy for us to see that and go, oh look, they've learned something. They know something about sea creatures. Yeah. But we might not think of the learning that they do in other kinds of shows and experiences as being equally valuable. But to your point, It can be, and it can be useful, and it doesn't have to just be book knowledge. It can be social experiences, awareness of their environment and their space.
Yeah.
So there's a broader range of kinds of things that one quote unquote learns or picks up.
Yeah, and there's like some level of engagement with the broader context that you can do through media versus like the horror of real life. But I
you're
don't
talking about things are great right now.
But I don't say that facetiously. I just think that there's a lot of different things around social, political issues that media can also convey and do and bring questions to the forefront, right? That maybe we're not comfortable figuring out how to do ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. Or that there is like a social reality too that's happening outside of screens that we don't really know how to navigate. Right.
Yeah. And boy, that goes down a whole nother thread of why it's important for our media to represent a wide range of experiences, right?
Yeah.
But one other thing I wanted to point out on the screen time is, and again, this is something you kind of alluded to, is that it's not just what's happening on the screen, it's also what's happening in the context and around and when the screen time is happening. I often think about like, not just what are you watching, but who are you watching with?
Yep.
What are you doing while you're watching it? And it's fun to watch things with kids, whether those are your kids or whether those are young people in your classroom. Spend time watching things with them. I know you and I have talked about the fact that in my family, Bob's Burgers is like kind of a family media that we all consume
and great
together.
Great costumes.
And exactly, and it bleeds into other things, right? It's not just the time we spend watching a show. Now it's part of the funny jokes we make with each other. It's the costumes we make together. And those are super rich relational and learning experiences as well.
Yeah, it's like identity work and community and belonging.
So screens are great. You heard it here first.
No, that's not true. Okay, so there are, obviously, we don't want to be utopian about screens, right?
Yes.
We're not ending it by saying like, oh, screen time is good, right? But I feel like nothing is all good and nothing is all bad.
Yeah.
And it really, like, I think at the end of the day, I think what we're both saying is that like there has to be a level of trust and agency afforded to kids to be able to make some of those decisions.
And as a responsible adult, you should pay attention to that.
Exactly.
And you should engage with them with it.
Yeah, exactly.
And not just assume it's either there's a magic number that you're shooting for.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all a little more complex than that. That's great. Okay, here's another one. Here's another fun question that I'm sure you get a lot. How can I make my curriculum play-based? Or maybe in addition to, how should I be defining and measuring play? I love it when someone asks how they should measure play. Like I said, I mean, it's pretty clear that I get just really frustrated by that kind of a question. It kind of feels to me to sort of miss the point of why we think play might be useful to incorporate in curriculum.
Yep.
But tell me how you define play.
I mean, okay. I don't know how to define play, but I will say it is useful to think about like the question that you're asking. Like play-based curriculum is actually different from playful conditions, right? And so I feel like, for instance, in my early childhood context, like there's lots of teachers or parents or educators who might come up to me and say like, well, we have all of these things to do in school, so we don't really have time to, quote, play.
Yeah, no time for play.
Yeah. I mean, that seems like already that you're kind of considering play as some kind of curricular thing or an adjacent curricular thing that you have to make time for.
Yeah.
But there are plenty of ways that you could create playful conditions. Like writing can be playful, right? Like science can be playful. Like all these things could be playful. So for me, it's more like the conditions that play can actually engender, right?
Yeah.
Like imagination, freedom, choices, flexibility, design. Like there's so many things that can be incorporated into play. But I feel like play-based curriculum, like basing a curriculum around some kind of components of play is curriculum. It's not necessarily play. It's just that you're trying to make it play-based, right? So
this happens with games all the time, right?
Yes.
There's game-based curriculum or I definitely don't love when we try to splice things together and don't understand that the issue isn't that there's not enough of X or Y. It's the issue that we framed both of them as separate beings, and that in reality, there's kind of ways in which they can kind of coexist and enhance one another. And in doing so, they both transform.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And certainly like trying to sort of say, okay, now it's work time, now it's play time, and we'll just try to figure out more blocks of play to sort of squeeze in.
It's kind of a false binary, and it's not helpful.
No, it devalues play, certainly, right? And it also it communicates to young people that these are separate things, and they should never intersect and intertwine.
Yeah.
Which is something you and I are still dealing with our colleagues sometimes, and with our students.
That's why we keep on popping and playing.
Here we are.
Okay, we digress. So this is a question that I think you probably get asked a lot. I will defer to you in this, but I may have an occasional comment or two.
I love it. Let's go.
So how do you respond when someone says, what video games or apps should my kids play with? And is it okay if my kid plays video game X Grand Theft Auto or something? Right. What do I do with those violent games?
Oh my God, I get asked this all the time.
I'm sure.
And I'm always like, I don't know. Like, number one, like, I'm not like on the App Store all the time figuring out which are the good apps. So it's a silly question as well, because there are some good games, there are some good apps, there are some bad games, there are some bad apps. Even if some games are kind of none of them are probably really, really bad for a kid. And games can be okay, they can be great. They, by and large, they give kids experiences to kind of explore new spaces, interact with systems and rules, engage in some sort of inquiry or problem-solving practices. Certainly, there are some games that are better than others, right? There are some games that really elevate young people's creative potential and opportunities to ask really interesting, innovative questions, to encounter and explore really deep and thoughtful stories, like we talked about with other media. Encounter different kinds of stories as well. But with regard to like the violent video games, this is one of those things where I'm always like, look, I don't know. I'm not the parent of this child we're talking about.
Yes.
You are, and that is a decision you need to make.
Yeah.
You need to sort of make a decision for yourself about how much exposure and engagement with violence, whether that's television shows, books, as you mentioned earlier, or video games, that you're okay with, that you're comfortable with. It is true that video games have this kind of interesting unique feature, which is that they are often very graphic these days with the graphic fidelity, and that they're interactive. That said, playing a violent video game is not going to make your child a violent child or person.
Yeah.
It's just not. There's mountains of evidence that says that is not true. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But being reflective on the amount and the level of exposure you want to have, you want your child to have for these kinds of things is really important. And to talk with them about that is important.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, because I feel like it's so easy for someone to say video games is like video games and violence is causal.
Yeah.
Right. So like, because you play video games, that's why you are violent. Right. And I think what that does is it kind of excuses the rest of us by being like, oh, you know what makes people violent? Violence.
It's easier to blame a video game than to
hunger, poverty, a crazy political system.
So much easier to blame Call of Duty than to solve that.
Say like it's a culmination of all of these other things that are happening in the landscape.
Yeah, 100%. And also another side of this that I think often gets left on the table is whether your kid comes home and plays Call of Duty at home, in your home, they are probably having conversations with their classmates and their friends about these games. Yeah. Right? I mean, you mentioned Grand Theft Auto. Like, there was a time where everyone was talking about and playing Grand Theft Auto, and you kind of needed to know something about Grand Theft Auto to engage in those conversations. And so kids did. They learned about it. They played it, whether it was at your house or a friend's house. And actually, that's kind of good for a socialization, to build ways to talk with friends about things that friends are interested in and that you're interested in, and engaging in that kind of larger social experience around these artifacts.
Yeah. And I think like media, books, and video games too are such an opportunity to engage in conversations with kids. Yeah. Right? Because those are imperfect materials made by imperfect people.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so there is a lot to talk about and discuss around those things as well.
And that's why my last point here is exactly what you're saying. You should play games with kids.
Yes.
The question shouldn't be which games should I let my kid play. It's like, what games can we play together?
Yeah.
it's fun, first of all, to play games with kids.
Yeah.
It also gives you new conversations to have. It invites you to kind of explore things that they're interested in. It also invites you to have those conversations and questions about all sorts of issues or topics that might be important and hard to have without having that artifact to think with and talk with.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Play games with kids.
Play games with kids.
Do it. Watch TV with kids. Play games with kids. Okay, one more question for you. Should kids be reading before they even get to school?
Okay.
I have this neighbor whose kid is already reading, and they're 2 years old. And should I be having my kid read?
Okay, I'm not even going to try to go a roundabout here. No, your kids do not have to read before they come to school, because my thing is to parents like, are you a teacher? You know how to teach reading? You're going to teach your kid how to read before they come to school?
Cool.
I do not feel like that is a prerequisite to coming to school. I feel like out of all the other things that give kids anxiety into coming into a new space like school, like I think the whole social readiness is probably much more important than reading readiness,
It was a miracle that my kids were potty trained before they went to school.
I mean, think of how it's a scary experience to have to set foot into a school, considering that all the rest of your time up until then, and you spend time at home with your parents.
Yep.
Like
a whole full day away from mom and dad with all these new other kids and teachers and adults.
My pro tip, yes, social readiness, potty trained.
Don't worry about the reading. Got it.
Yeah, that's a little bit more important.
Fantastic. So these are just a few of the questions that you and I encounter that people like to ask us. And as we said before, I mean, I think these are hard questions, partly because people really intently want to do well by the young people in their lives. But they might not always be the right kinds of questions that they should be thinking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to read this whole Little Prince quote because you made fun of me prior to this. But I do love this. And the reason why I love this is because this quote is basically the idea that we as adults love to measure things and love to ask maybe sometimes the wrong questions. And so what it says is, grown-ups love figures. When you tell them you've made a new friend, they never ask you any questions about essential matters. They never say to you, what does his voice sound like? What games does he love best? Does he collect butterflies? Instead, they demand, how old is he? How much does he weigh? How much money does his father make? And so these are, those questions are, there's an example of just like different things that we ask about very like superficial things about other people.
Yeah. I'm always asking my kids how much their friends weigh.
Anyway, but it goes on to say, only from these figures do they think they have learned anything about him.
Right.
And we know that doesn't really measure a person.
That's right.
Yeah. So maybe it's not about asking those questions. Maybe it's thinking about things that we should measure, better off asking, like, do kids find joy? Are they creative? Are they finding places where they feel valued? And have experiences with them. Take interest in them. Play games with them.
Play games with kids.
Watch their TV shows, even though some of them are kind of annoying.
Sometimes they're annoying. But taking their interest seriously is such a hugely important thing.
Yes.
And I think it's astonishing how hard it is for us adults to remember that. We are not just their protectors and providers and the person who like makes their dinner and makes sure their bed is comfortable. We are also people in their lives with relationships, hopefully. And part of building those relationships with a kid is the same way you build relationships with your friends and your partners, right? Is having meaningful conversations, talking about things that one another care about, engaging with them together. And we should be doing that with young people.
Yeah, exactly.
Nailed it.
Yep. Thank you for letting us pop off this week.
That was a nice pop off. It's good to talk about those questions.
Yes.
And before we leave, we want to encourage you, if you get a chance, we have a survey on our website at tc.edu/popandplay. There's also a link to this survey in the show notes. Take a look at it. Tell us what you're enjoying about the show. Tell us what you'd like to see us do more. We'd love to hear from you.
Don't forget to share it with your friends and subscribe on wherever you get your podcast.
Yep, and season 5? What season are we on? Season 5
is coming up very soon.
Very soon.
Stay tuned.
Check your dial. Bye.